September 15th, 1940. 60 feet underground, beneath a Victorian mansion in Uxbridge, 20 miles west of London, Winston Churchill sits in a chair at the back of a room and watches a map table. The room is the filter room of No. 11 Group Operations. Along one wall, a board of indicator lights tracks the status of every RAF fighter squadron in southeastern England. Available, airborne, refueling. Churchill watches. He has been here for 4 hours. One by one, the lights change. At the start of the day, the board had the density of a defended country. Squadrons in reserve, options open, room to maneuver. Now, as the afternoon reaches its critical hours, the lights move with gathering urgency. Available becomes airborne. Airborne becomes refueling. Refueling becomes nothing. Squadron after squadron, gone. The board is almost empty. An aide records Churchill leaning forward, almost to himself, asking, "Don't spare me. What have we got left?" He is told, nothing. Every squadron is either in the air or on the ground, unable to fight. If the Luftwaffe launches a third wave this afternoon, there is nothing, not a single organized defensive flight, to stop it. Churchill says nothing. He sits with his unlit cigar and looks at the board. This is September 15th, 1940. Go back 88 days. June 22nd, 1940. A French delegation signs an armistice in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. The same carriage in which Germany had surrendered in 1918, selected by Hitler for the point it made. 43 days. That is how long it took. On May 10th, Germany launched its Western offensive. By June 22nd, France was gone. For the people of Britain, absorbing this required something close to recalibration. Every European leader thus far challenged by Adolf Hitler had either backed down or been conquered. Norway had fallen, Holland had fallen, Belgium had fallen. France, the great continental power, the army that was supposed to hold the line, had not merely been defeated, it had collapsed. The British Army came home from Dunkirk. More than 338,000 men lifted off beaches in an improvisation of warships and fishing boats and pleasure craft that was both genuine and a defeat. The soldiers were alive. Their equipment was not. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of artillery pieces, the accumulated hardware of an expeditionary army, all of it left behind on French sand. Air raid shelters went up in streets and gardens. Gas masks were issued to every civilian. Children were bundled onto trains and sent to the countryside, some of them overseas to Canada and Australia. The beaches of southern England were mined. The army, stripped of its weapons, was put on invasion alert. And in a series of war cabinet meetings in late May, while Dunkirk was still in progress, the question was asked openly. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, pressed his colleagues to consider opening peace negotiations through Mussolini as an intermediary. Not surrender. Exploration. His arithmetic was not unreasonable. Germany held the continent, the army was in chaos on a beach, and Mussolini had not yet formally entered the war. Halifax was not a coward. He was a rational man doing rational arithmetic on a situation that looked genuinely catastrophic. Churchill resisted. The meetings ran over days. The vote could have gone the other way. The public did not know this. Parliament did not know this. The world did not know this. They would see only the result. A prime minister who refused to come to the table, and a nation that apparently stood firm. On July 16th, having received that refusal, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 16. The order was for preparations to invade the British Isles, Operation Sea Lion. The language was contemptuous. As England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, shows no sign of willingness to come to terms, the directive read, "I've decided to prepare for, and if necessary to carry out, an invasion of England." He expected capitulation to follow. It did not come. Everything that follows flows from that. There were two men whose decisions would determine whether Britain survived the summer. They had never met. They had almost nothing in common except that both had been young men in the last war, and both had flown. Hugh Dowding was 58, lean and angular, with a long face and the composed expression of a man who had learned not to waste energy on display. His pilots called him Stuffy. The nickname was accurate and incomplete. Beneath the reserve was a man who referred to his pilots as his chicks and thought about their survival with a methodical intensity that the Air Ministry found professionally inconvenient. His own son Derek was among them. What Dowding had built over the preceding years was unlike anything that existed anywhere in the world. The Dowding system, radar stations along the coast feeding information to a central plotting room at RAF Bentley Priory outside London. Observer Corps tracking raids inland, sector controllers directing fighters by radio, phone lines buried deep enough to survive bombing. Every component connected into a network. The system's power was not in any single piece of it. The power was in the integration. He had fought for it. The Air Ministry had resisted him at virtually every turn. Resources for radar. Resources for fighters over bombers. Bulletproof windshields for cockpits. When he was told the windshields were too expensive, he replied, "If Chicago gangsters can have bulletproof glass in their cars, I can't see any reason why my pilots cannot have the same." He got the windshields. Most critically, he had fought to keep his squadrons in Britain when France was falling. In May 1940, he wrote to the Air Ministry in terms that could not be misread. If fighter command was drained away in desperate attempts to save France, defeat in France would involve the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country. He chose that word carefully. Irremediable. No recovery. No second chance. The squadrons stayed. Hermann Goering was 47 and enormous, barrel-chested, florid, dressed in a self-designed Reichsmarshal's uniform that grew more theatrical as the war progressed. He had 22 aerial victories from the last war and had commanded the Richthofen Circus. The courage was real. The strategic judgment in 1940 was not. He had promised Hitler that the Luftwaffe alone could force Britain to its knees. No ground invasion required. This was the boast of a man who had never delivered at that scale, made to a dictator who wanted to believe him. Dowding thought about consequences. Goering thought about reputation. This distinction would matter. There is one more thing to understand about the speeches Churchill gave that summer. The peroration of June 4th. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender," was heard by the House of Commons as the purest expression of national will in the English language. A section of the Conservative Party received it in sullen silence. The Labour MP Emmanuel Shinwell recalled that all the oratory could not remove the depression the House felt that day. But in Washington, it was heard differently. President Roosevelt had made clear through quiet channels that he needed a commitment, that even in defeat, Britain would not surrender her fleet. If the Navy went to South Africa and Canada and Australia rather than to Germany, American intervention would follow. Churchill knew this when he rose to speak. The most famous act of British defiance was simultaneously a guarantee to a neutral power 3,000 miles away. The public heard defiance. Roosevelt heard a promise. They were both listening to the same speech. On July 10th, the Luftwaffe began attacking convoys in the English Channel. The Kanalkampf, the Channel battles, ran for more than a month. Germany probing, Britain responding. Standing patrols over the convoys, fuel gauges dropping, fighters scrambling on inadequate warning. The number of ships sunk became so great that the Admiralty eventually cancelled all daylight convoys through the Channel altogether. The RAF met the Germans with the Spitfire. Slender, fast, matched against the Bf-109 closely enough that the outcome of any individual fight depended on the pilot, and the Hurricane, stockier, more numerous, assigned to the bombers while Spitfires went for the escorts. The Bf-109 had fuel injection that let it push into a dive without its engine cutting out, an advantage in close combat, but it had only 20 to 30 minutes over England before it had to turn for France. A German pilot with a damaged aircraft over Kent was either a prisoner or a casualty. A British pilot with a damaged aircraft over Kent might be back in the air by evening. Fighter. Command's pilots flew in tight V formations of 3 aircraft, designed to concentrate fire. German pilots, veterans of Spain and Poland, called them Idiotenreihen, rows of idiots. The formations restricted maneuverability and killed visibility. Veterans who survived long enough began quietly abandoning them, adopting the loose German finger 4. 2 pairs, spread like a hand, which let pilots scan the sky instead of watching their wingman's wingtip. Surviving was how you learned. The difficulty was surviving long enough. On August 13th, Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe launched 1,485 sorties against RAF airfields and aircraft factories. The intelligence was poor. Many airfields targeted were not fighter command bases, and British defenses remained intact. 15 RAF fighters were destroyed. 39 German aircraft were lost. Germany had expected to cripple fighter command in 4 days. The arithmetic was not working out. 2 days later, August 15th, all 3 Luftwaffe air fleets flew simultaneously, the largest coordinated effort of the campaign. 76 German aircraft were shot down. 35 British. The Luftwaffe crews who came home called it Black Thursday. Into this battle, at the beginning of August, came the men of No. 303 Squadron. They were Polish. Most had already fought in 2 countries and watched both fall. They had been made to requalify on British aircraft and were viewed with institutional wariness by commanders who did not know what to make of them. The wariness did not last. In 42 days of combat, 303 Squadron claimed 126 German aircraft destroyed. They pressed their attacks to distances that alarmed their section leaders and achieved kill ratios that silenced argument. They were fighting for a country they could not go home to. In some way, that was the point. Nearly a quarter of the pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain were not British. 145 Poles, 88 Czechoslovaks, 126 New Zealanders, 98 Canadians, Americans, South Africans, Belgians, Free French. The phrase, "Britain stood alone," conjures a specific image. The men who held the line were a more complicated group than that image admits. Between August 24th and September 6th, the Luftwaffe stopped trying to win the battle the wrong way and began trying to win it the right way. The target was no longer shipping, no longer scattered airfields misidentified by poor intelligence. The target was the sector stations of No. 11 Group, Biggin Hill, Manston, Kenley, Hornchurch, the nerve centers of the Dowding system. The places where raids were tracked and fighters directed. Attack the radar and you blind fighter command. Attack the sector stations and you sever its nervous system. Attack both, and the integrated network that Dowding had spent years constructing becomes a collection of isolated parts. Germany was now attacking the right things. The effect was measurable and severe. Pilots were flying 3 sorties a day. Some fell asleep in their cockpits between scrambles. Ground crews worked under open sky because the maintenance facilities were rubble. Sector station after sector station was hit. Communications severed, plotting rooms destroyed, runways cratered. The network that depended on every part remaining connected to every other was being unpicked, link by link. Then there were the losses. Fighter command was losing pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Aircraft production was running at roughly 300 planes a week. Pilot output was around 200. Every week, the gap widened. An aircraft without a pilot cannot fly. and pilots, unlike aircraft, cannot be manufactured in a week. On August 16th, the intelligence section of the Luftwaffe High Command issued an assessment. Fighter Command, it concluded, had approximately 300 fighters remaining. The actual figure was considerably higher. This number, this catastrophically wrong number, is one of the most consequential intelligence failures in the history of air power. German command believed it was finishing off a broken force. Fresh British squadrons were rotating into the fight. RAF repair facilities were replacing aircraft faster than German analysts accounted for. The integrated system Dowding had built allowed Fighter Command to concentrate force, rotate exhausted units out, bring rested ones in, and appear to German observers far weaker than it was, because what Germany was counting was the components, not the whole. They were not mopping up. They were still fighting a coherent enemy. They had no idea. But here is what is also true. The airfields were failing. The sector stations were being systematically unmade. If the campaign had continued at the same pace for another 2 weeks, Fighter Command would have ceased to function as an organized defensive force. Not in speculation, not in retrospect dressed as pessimism. This is the considered verdict of nearly every historian who has examined the operational records. The pilots were still flying, they were still fighting, but the machine that allowed them to fight together, to be more than a collection of individual men in individual aircraft, was being taken apart beneath them. Britain was losing. The British public did not know. The exhausted pilots suspected. The Luftwaffe commanders believed they were almost done. None of these 3 things was entirely true. But the one that mattered most, that the airfield campaign was working, was true. It ran for 13 days. Then something happened. The night of August 24th. Somewhere over England, a German bomber crew is off course. Their target is an industrial site along the Thames estuary. What falls from their aircraft falls on central London instead. Whether navigation error, equipment failure, or misidentification in darkness, the exact cause remains uncertain. The bombs hit city streets. Churchill's response is immediate. The following night, 81 Bomber Command aircraft fly over Berlin. They hit Tempelhof Airfield and the Siemens factory. The damage is relatively limited, but they reach Berlin. Hitler had promised the German people that Berlin would never be bombed. Now it has been bombed. He is furious in a way that overrides calculation. He orders the Luftwaffe to shift its primary effort. No more airfields. London. The previous 13 days were spent establishing, with care and at considerable cost, that the correct strategy was the destruction of Fighter Command's infrastructure. Germany was winning that argument. Sector stations were failing. Pilots were running out. The system Dowding had spent 20 years building was approaching the moment where its connections could no longer hold. 2 more weeks, perhaps fewer, and the campaign stops. Not because of British courage, though there was courage, not because of Spitfire production figures, though the factories were running, because a navigator made an error and a dictator let the insult override the strategy. It is September 7th when the full weight of the shift becomes clear. 300 German bombers approach London in the late afternoon. The RAF scrambles, expecting, based on 2 months of precedent, another attack on the airfields. They are wrong. What the fighter pilots find, breaking through a haze layer east of the Thames, is something without precedent. An aerial formation covering 800 square miles, more than 1.5 miles high, coming in like a tide. The docklands burn first. Bermondsey, Wapping, Mill Wall. Warehouses full of paint and rubber and timber catch and do not stop. The Thames appears to the firemen on its banks to be on fire itself. The second wave of bombers arrives after dark and uses the first wave's fires as a navigation beacon. By morning, the glow is visible 40 miles away. The Blitz has begun, and fighter command's airfields are not being bombed. The exhausted sector stations begin to recover. Plotters return to their operations rooms. Communications links are repaired. The machine slowly, painfully reconnects. Now it is September 15th. Return to the room underground at Uxbridge. Churchill is in the same chair, the same table, the same board of indicator lights. But anyone watching him now has something that the man in the chair does not, everything that led to this moment. The 13 days of airfield attacks, the night of August 24th, the navigator's error, and the dictator's rage, and the decision that took the pressure off at the precise moment the pressure was closest to breaking. The thing it was pressing. They understand, in a way Churchill cannot, the full shape of the gamble he is watching resolve itself. The squadrons go up. The board empties. The lights move to their worst position. He asks what reserves exist. He is told, none. Every squadron is either airborne or on the ground, refueling, unable to fight. If a third wave comes, there is nothing to stop it. He says nothing for a long time. The third wave does not come. Weather has closed in over France. The Luftwaffe, worn down by weeks of attrition, does not find the strength for another push. On September 15th, Germany loses 56 aircraft. Britain loses 29. 2 days later, September 17th, Hitler meets with Göring and Generalfeldmarschall von Rundstedt. The conclusion is reached without ceremony. Operation Sea Lion is not viable. The barges assembled in the harbours of France and Belgium, more than 1,200 flat-bottomed river craft, packed into channel ports in full view of RAF reconnaissance, begin to disperse. They move back into the rivers and canals from which they came, quietly, without announcement. Britain does not know the invasion is over. The sirens still sound every evening. The bombers still come. The pilots still climb into their aircraft in the morning, but the barges are gone. The reckoning does not arrive cleanly. By the end of 1940, 23,000 British civilians are dead. More than 20,000 Londoners will be killed over the full course of the Blitz. 1 in 6 people in the capital will be bombed out of their homes. Through the autumn and into winter, Londoners descend each evening into underground stations, spreading blankets on the platform tiles, sleeping in shifts, breathing the smell of sweat and coal dust and damp wool, listening to the muffled crump of bombs through 30 feet of London clay. A September poll finds 31% of Londoners getting no sleep at all, 32% getting fewer than 4 hours. This is the cost on one side of the ledger. The other side requires equal honesty. Churchill himself never used the phrase, "Britain stood alone." He spoke of Britain and the British Empire. He spoke of the British Empire and its Commonwealth. He spoke of nations beyond the Commonwealth, Nepal, Oman, that had declared war against Germany in 1939 anyway. After France fell, Germany was simultaneously at war with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. The men of No. 303 Squadron, the top-scoring fighter unit in the entire Battle of Britain, 126 kills in 42 days, were Polish. On September 15th, as the board at Uxbridge emptied, Polish pilots made up nearly a fifth of the RAF fighters in the air and shot down 16 German aircraft. These were men who had already watched their country fall. They flew for an ally that would, at Yalta, hand Poland to Stalin. They knew, or might have suspected, that no victory over Germany would return them to what they had left. They flew anyway. On August 22nd, Britain passed the Allied Forces Act, formally recognizing the armed forces of occupied nations. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, Free France. In September, Roosevelt approved the destroyers for bases agreement. 50 American destroyers for the Royal Navy in exchange for leases on British Caribbean bases. The strategy Churchill had encoded into the speeches of June, the performance of defiance for an American audience that needed to believe Britain was worth backing, was producing results. Edward R. Murrow was on a London rooftop during the bombing, broadcasting to America. 3 words at the start of each dispatch. "This is London." 3 words that placed American living rooms inside it. Not a speech, not a diplomatic cable. Evidence. What Britain was in the summer and autumn of 1940 was the last coherent defensive position in Western Europe, the last place where organized resistance to Germany remained possible, where what had been surrendered everywhere else might still be recovered. That is what alone means. Not that the island held no allies, but that it was the last ground left. And the people who held it were not all British. That, too, is part of the story. And the man most responsible for the ground-holding was fired. In November 1940, Hugh Dowding was removed from command of Fighter Command against his wishes. The stated reason was the ongoing argument over tactics. The big wing approach, championed by Trafford, Lee, Mallory, and Douglas Bader, which favored assembling large formations before engaging. Dowding and Keith Park had won that argument, in operational terms, by winning the battle. They were overruled regardless. Sholto Douglas, a big wing advocate, took Dowding's place. No appropriate ceremony was arranged. No immediate peerage. Lord Balfour, who visited Dowding shortly after the dismissal, wrote that Dowding had saved us and thereby, I believe, the civilized world. But Britain behaved as it always seems to in such circumstances. It promptly turned round and started criticizing the man who had been responsible for our salvation. Dowding's old adversary, Hugh Trenchard, who had opposed him for 26 years across virtually every significant question of RAF doctrine, eventually sought him out and told him, "I've been guilty of gravely underestimating you for 26 years. The peerage came in 1943. The battle had been won in 1940. He spent his later years in pursuits the establishment found eccentric: spiritualism, campaigns against animal vivisection, a deliberate withdrawal from public life. He was a private man who had never sought the stage, and he left it without ceremony. He died in 1970, aged 87. His ashes rest below the Battle of Britain memorial window in the Royal Air Force Chapel at Westminster Abbey. 3 years after the battle, in November 1943, a captured German lecture circulated through British intelligence. The chief of the German General Staff in the West, speaking in a closed session, assessed what had gone wrong. The German army, he stated, could not invade England until the British air arm had been completely beaten. We were not able to do it. Not in 1940, when such an admission was impossible. In 1943 in private, because it was simply true. The sector stations and the plotting rooms, the radar on the cliffs, the buried phone lines, the exhausted pilots flying their 3rd sortie of the day. All of it held long enough for the calculation to change, long enough for the barges to go back to their rivers, long enough for the decisive battles, wherever they would eventually be fought, to remain possible. The margin was a navigation error, a dictator's pride, a 13-day campaign that ended when it did, and not 2 weeks later. In Britain, they call it the finest hour. The man most responsible for it was shown the door before the year was out. History found him eventually. Britain took its time.